Between them, they account for more deaths than the First World War. None of their inventors wanted this. Most of them lived to see what they had created. Some of them tried to stop it. None of them could. 6 inventions. 6 men who believed they were making the world safer. One number that connects all of them. 160 million dead, by the most conservative estimate. That is not a war. That is a set of patents. The road to catastrophe is not paved with malice. It is paved with engineering optimism and a failure to ask the second question. The first question is always, does it work? The second question, the one nobody asks often enough, is, what else does it work on? Invention 1, Dynamite. Invention 2, DDT. Invention 3, Chlorine gas. Invention 4, Asbestos. Invention 5, leaded gasoline. Invention 6, the lobotomy. 6 people tried to make the world safer. Between them, they made it more dangerous than any war. Alfred Nobel was 52 years old when he watched his younger brother Emile die in an explosion at the family factory. The year was 1864. The substance was nitroglycerin, a liquid explosive so unstable that it could detonate from a change in temperature, a vibration, or no visible cause at all. Nobel was a chemist. He was also a businessman. He understood that the world needed a safer explosive. The mining industry, the railroad industry, the construction industry all ran on explosives. Nitroglycerin was powerful enough to move mountains. The problem was that it moved the people nearby as well. For 3 years he experimented. He tried mixing nitroglycerin with various absorbent materials, sawdust, brick dust, charcoal. None of them worked well enough. Then, in 1867, possibly by accident, accounts differ, he found that a porous silica clay called kieselguhr could absorb nitroglycerin in a ratio of 3 to 1. The mixture was stable. It could be dropped, heated, transported. It only detonated when exposed to a blasting cap. He called it dynamite, from the Greek dynamis, power. The patent was filed in 1867. Within 4 years, factories in 14 countries were producing it. Within a decade, dynamite had transformed every industry that needed to move earth. Mines went deeper. Tunnels pierced mountains. Harbors were blasted into coastlines. Railways crossed terrain that had been impassable. Nobel became one of the richest men in Europe. He believed he had solved the industrial world's most dangerous problem. He was not wrong. He had made construction safer. What he had also done, and what he had not sufficiently considered, was put a stable, portable, and powerful explosive into the hands of everyone who had a reason to destroy things. Armies adopted dynamite within a decade. Anarchists adopted it within 2. Between the 1870s and 1914, dynamite was used in more than 1,000 political assassinations, bombings, and attacks across Europe and North America. The era became known as the Age of Dynamite. Tsar Alexander II of Russia was killed with it in 1881. A French president in 1894. The Wall Street bombing of 1920 killed 38 people and injured hundreds more. These were not aberrations. They were the predictable behavior of a destabilized political landscape that now had access to reliable, portable, cheap explosive power. The mining and railroad industries also used dynamite to break strikes. Company guards used it against workers. Workers used it against company property. Nobel's invention that was meant to replace unpredictable nitroglycerin became the universal tool of anyone who needed to destroy something and could afford the relatively modest price per stick. Then came the industrial-scale military applications. Dynamite and its derivatives became the primary explosive material in both world wars. Howitzer shells, naval mines, aerial bombs, and demolition charges, the mechanized slaughter of the Western Front, the carpet bombing of the Second World War, all ran on the chemistry that Nobel had refined and patented in a Swedish laboratory in 1867. By 1945, the number of people killed by explosive weapons derived directly or indirectly from Nobel's invention runs into the tens of millions. Nobel found out about the first applications early. In 1888, a French newspaper ran his obituary by mistake. They had confused him with his brother Ludwig, who had just died. The headline read, "Quote zero." The article described him as a man who had grown rich by finding ways to kill people faster than ever before. Nobel read his own obituary. He had 8 years left to live. He rewrote his will. He left his entire fortune, approximately $265 million in today's value, to a foundation that would award annual prizes for achievement in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. He had spent his life making destruction more efficient. He spent his last years trying to redirect the energy toward the opposite. His correspondence from those final 8 years shows a man who understood exactly what the obituary had described. He did not dispute it. He tried to answer it. The Nobel Peace Prize was first awarded in 1901. Alfred Nobel died in 1896 without seeing it. He did not live to know whether the prize would change anything. It has not changed anything in the way he hoped. The explosives industry he created is still the largest in the world by revenue. His name is on both. In 1948, Paul Hermann Müller was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. The prize committee described his discovery as having saved more lives than any other single achievement in the history of medicine. The discovery was DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, an insecticide. Müller had synthesized it in 1938 while working for the Swiss chemical company Geigy. He was looking for a substance that could kill insects cheaply and remain effective over time. DDT did this spectacularly well. It was cheap, stable, easy to produce, and lethal to virtually every insect species it contacted. The timing mattered. By 1943, the Allied military was fighting in malaria zones, North Africa, the Pacific Islands, Italy. Malaria killed more soldiers than combat in several theaters of the war. DDT was deployed in aerosol form. It worked. Malaria rates in treated areas dropped dramatically. When the war ended, DDT was credited with preventing an estimated 5 million military deaths. The civilian applications began immediately. The World Health Organization launched a global malaria eradication campaign in 1955. DDT was the central tool. India's malaria cases dropped from 75 million annually to fewer than 50,000 within a decade. Sri Lanka went from 3 million cases per year to 17. These are documented public health records. The WHO campaign is estimated to have prevented between 3 and 500 million deaths from malaria alone, predominantly in children under 5 in tropical regions. This is one of the largest public health achievements in recorded history. The problem was what DDT did when it left the mosquito. DDT does not break down in organic tissue. It bioaccumulates, meaning it concentrates as it moves up the food chain. A mosquito absorbs a small dose. A small fish eats 10,000 mosquitoes. A large bird eats 100 small fish. The bird now carries 10,000 times the original dose. In birds of prey, DDT interfered with calcium metabolism, specifically the ability to form eggshells. The shells became too thin to survive incubation. Birds stopped reproducing. By the early 1960s, populations of bald eagles, peregrine falcons, ospreys and pelicans had collapsed across North America and Europe by between 70 and 90%. The broader ecological findings came from a marine biologist named Rachel Carson. Her 1962 book, Silent Spring, documented the cascading effects. DDT in the soil, DDT in rivers, DDT in marine sediments, DDT in human breast milk. Carson was not an activist. She was a scientist who had worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 15 years. She assembled government data, peer-reviewed studies, and documented field observations. The chemical industry spent approximately $250,000, equivalent to over $2 million today, trying to discredit her. One industry spokesperson described Carson as __, quote _1__. The company Velsicol threatened to sue her publisher. A former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture asked publicly why a spinster with no children cared so much about future generations. Carson died of cancer in 1964, 2 years after publication, before DDT was banned in the United States. The ban came in 1972. By then, DDT had been found in the tissue of Antarctic penguins, birds that had never been near a treated field in their lives. It had moved through the global food chain and deposited itself at both poles. The concentrations in some marine mammals were high enough to impair reproduction. The compound Müller had synthesized to kill mosquitoes in a Swiss laboratory in 1938 had, within 30 years, distributed itself across the entire planetary food web. Paul Müller died in 1965. He had received the Nobel Prize. He had also received, in the years before his death, the early reports of ecological damage. There is no record of his public response to them. His Nobel citation, the one that described his discovery as having saved more lives than any other achievement in the history of medicine, is accurate. The ecological record, compiled in the 2 decades after his death, is also accurate. Both things are true simultaneously. This is the problem. DDT is still used in some malaria endemic regions under controlled protocols. The math has never been simple. Malaria kills children. Eagles are not children. Every public health official who has wrestled with this knows the calculation does not come out clean. Fritz Haber won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918. The prize was for nitrogen fixation, the Haber-Bosch process, which synthesizes ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. This process is responsible for approximately half of the nitrogen in the soil that feeds the current world population. Without it, historians estimate that between 3 and 4 billion people alive today would not exist, because the food to sustain them could not be grown. Fritz Haber also invented chemical warfare. These are not 2 different men. They are the same man in the same decade, making the same kind of decision. The decision that a tool is just a tool, and the use of that tool is someone else's problem. The story of chlorine gas does not begin as a weapon. Chlorine was used industrially for decades before 1914, primarily in water purification and bleaching. It was understood to be toxic, but its toxicity was considered an occupational hazard, manageable with ventilation and care. Haber understood the chemistry completely. In 1914, Haber began working for the German military on chemical agents. His argument, recorded in letters and in the accounts of colleagues, was that a chemical weapon that could end a battle quickly was ultimately more humane than artillery that dragged wars out for years. He was not the last person to make this argument. He was the first to make it about poison gas. On April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, the German military released 168 tons of chlorine gas from 5,700 cylinders along a 4-mile front. The gas drifted into the Allied trenches. The soldiers had no protection. Some ran. Some tried to climb above the cloud. Most could do neither fast enough. Chlorine destroys lung tissue on contact. Death by chlorine inhalation is drowning, internal drowning, as the lungs fill with fluid produced by the chemical reaction. The soldiers at Ypres described a yellow-green cloud approaching at ground level. The ones who survived described the smell of bleach and a burning sensation that began at the eyes and moved into the throat and chest. Between 6,000 and 10,000 men were killed or permanently disabled in that single attack. Over the course of the First World War, chemical weapons, chlorine, then phosgene, then mustard gas, killed approximately 90,000 people and injured over 1 million more. Many men who were gassed and survived developed lung conditions that killed them years or decades later. Many were blind. Haber was in Ypres. He supervised the release personally. He returned home to Berlin the following week. On the night of May 1st, his wife Clara, herself a chemist, the first woman to earn a doctorate in chemistry from the University of Breslau, took his army pistol into the garden of their home and shot herself. She died in the arms of their 12-year-old son, Hermann. She had spent the previous months arguing with Haber that chemical warfare was a perversion of science. She wrote to colleagues that what Haber was doing was a sign of barbarity, corrupting the very discipline which ought to bring new insights into life. She is believed to have left no final written explanation of her decision. The following morning, Fritz Haber departed for the Eastern Front to supervise a second gas attack. He left his son in the house with his wife's body. He spent the rest of the war developing new agents. After the war, he returned to chemical research. He was Jewish. He had converted to Christianity and considered himself German to his core. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, they dismissed him from his position regardless. He died in exile in 1934. The Zyklon B compound, used in the Nazi extermination camps, was developed by a company in which Haber had worked. He did not develop it for that purpose. He was dead before that purpose was realized. His extended family died in the camps. The question of what Fritz Haber knew and when, and whether he could have stopped what he started, has been debated by historians for a century. There is no clean answer. There is a Nobel Prize on one side of the ledger and a generation of gassed soldiers on the other, and both were produced by the same mind in the same decade, with the same conviction that the ends justified the chemistry. Asbestos was not invented, it was mined, but the decision to build an industrial civilization on top of it, to put it in every building, every ship, every boiler room, every school ceiling, every pipe, every brake pad, was a choice made by engineers, executives, and regulators across the late 19th and entire 20th century. That choice is what killed people. The material is ancient. The Romans knew it. The word comes from the Greek for indestructible. It is a naturally occurring silicate mineral that forms in fibrous crystals. The fibers are extraordinarily thin, thinner than a human hair by a factor of hundreds, and extraordinarily durable. They do not burn. They do not conduct heat. They do not corrode. For the industrial age, asbestos was a perfect material. The first documented cases of asbestosis, lung disease caused by inhaled asbestos fibers, were recorded in 1898 by a factory inspector in London named Lucy Dean. She filed a report to the British government describing the lung damage she had observed in asbestos textile workers and recommending investigation. The report was received. It was not acted upon. In 1906, French medical inspector Auribold published autopsy findings from a French asbestos textile factory. 50 workers had died of lung disease in a single decade. Similar reports followed in Germany, the United States, and Canada through the 1910s and 20s. In 1930, a British physician named Dr. W. E. Cook published a clinical description of the condition he named asbestosis. The same year, the British government commissioned a study that documented a clear and direct causal relationship between asbestos dust inhalation and terminal lung disease. It recommended dust control measures and periodic medical examinations for workers. The American industry did not follow the science or the British example. In 1935, the Saranac Laboratory in the United States conducted animal experiments that confirmed what the clinical evidence had already established. Asbestos fibers cause lung cancer. The findings were shared with the insurance company Metropolitan Life and with asbestos manufacturers. The manufacturers persuaded the laboratory to withhold publication of the results. The results were not published for decades. What follows is a documented corporate history, not a theory. The internal records of the Johns Manville Corporation, the largest asbestos producer in the United States, show that executives read physician reports describing fatal lung disease in their workers and made deliberate decisions about how to handle those reports. A 1933 letter from the company's lawyer advised that they should not warn workers of their illness because, once informed, the workers could not be prevented from seeking legal remedies. Johns Manville knew. They had known since at least the 1930s. They continued to manufacture and sell asbestos products for 50 more years. When the first wave of worker lawsuits arrived in the 1960s and 70s, the company spent heavily on legal defense and on lobbying to limit damages. When the lawsuits became unmanageable, they filed for bankruptcy in 1982, one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in American history at the time. The reorganization created a trust fund for asbestos victims. The fund was initially set at approximately $820 million. It was not sufficient. The global mesothelioma death toll from asbestos-caused cancer alone, not including asbestosis and related diseases, is estimated at 250,000 annually as of this decade. The total 20th century death toll from asbestos-related disease runs between 5 and 10 million, with the peak deaths still arriving because the latency period between exposure and cancer onset is between 20 and 50 years. People are still dying from asbestos exposure that occurred in the 1970s. In some countries, they are still dying from exposure that occurred last year. Asbestos was banned in the European Union in 1999. It is not banned in the United States. Approximately 50 countries worldwide have no asbestos ban. Thomas Midgley Jr. held more patents than almost any other American chemist of the 20th century. He was awarded the Priestley Medal, the highest honor of the American Chemical Society. He has also been described by environmental historian J.R. McNeill as the single organism that had the most impact on the atmosphere in Earth's history. Midgley did this twice. In 1921, working for General Motors Research, Midgley was tasked with solving the problem of engine knock, the rattling, damaging detonation that occurred in high-compression gasoline engines. He tested hundreds of additives. He found that tetraethyl lead, a compound of lead and carbon, eliminated the knocking problem almost completely. He patented it. General Motors formed the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation in 1923 to produce and sell leaded gasoline. Lead poisoning was not a new concern in 1923. Lead's neurological effects on humans had been documented in industrial settings since the 19th century. Lead paint poisoning in children was clinically established by the early 20th century. In October 1924, 5 workers at a Standard Oil plant in New Jersey that produced tetraethyl lead died within days. 35 more were hospitalized with acute lead poisoning. Several of them hallucinated and required physical restraint. The plant was immediately nicknamed the House of Butterflies by workers, a reference to the visual hallucinations that preceded the most severe cases. Midgley was not at the plant. He was sick. He had been treating himself for lead poisoning for months, which he did not publicize. He gave a press conference in October 1924 in which he poured tetraethyl lead over his hands and held a vial of it under his nose for a full minute, telling reporters there was no danger whatsoever in the product. He then spent several months recovering from lead poisoning at a clinic in Miami. Leaded gasoline went into global production. By the 1970s, airborne lead in the United States, primarily from automobile exhaust, was approximately 250 times the natural background level. The peak blood lead levels of American children in the 1970s were high enough to cause measurable IQ reduction, behavioral problems, and developmental delays, according to retrospective epidemiological studies. The removal of lead from gasoline, which began in the United States in the 1970s, following the work of geochemist Claire Patterson, who had spent 2 decades documenting the contamination, is estimated to have raised average IQ scores in the United States by several points. One study estimates that the average American born before 1996 lost between 2 and 5 IQ points to childhood lead exposure compared to post-lead removal cohorts. Midgley's second invention, in 1929, was chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, marketed as Freon, a class of refrigerant compounds designed to replace the toxic and flammable substances previously used in refrigerators. CFCs were stable, non-toxic, non-flammable, and worked perfectly. They were adopted globally. They were also, as discovered by Mario Molina and Sherwood Rowland in 1974, systematically destroying the ozone layer. Midgley died in 1944 from a mechanical apparatus of his own invention, a system of pulleys and ropes he had built to help himself get out of bed after he contracted polio. He became entangled in it and was strangled. He never knew about the ozone layer. In 1935, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz attended a conference in London at which the American neurologist John Fulton presented research on 2 chimpanzees. The chimpanzees had been subjected to surgical removal of their frontal lobes. The result, Fulton reported, was that the chimpanzees, who had previously been anxious and difficult to manage, became calm and compliant. Moniz returned to Lisbon and within months had performed the first prefrontal leucotomy on a human patient. He drilled holes in the skull and used a modified surgical instrument to cut through the white matter connecting the frontal lobes to the rest of the brain. The procedure was later renamed the lobotomy, from the Greek for lobe cutting. The patients most commonly described as good candidates for lobotomy were those with severe intractable mental illness, schizophrenia, severe depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, who had not responded to other treatments. In 1935, the treatments for severe mental illness were limited: sedation, hydrotherapy, insulin coma therapy. The mental health system was managing a patient population for whom nothing worked well and for whom the alternatives were few. Against this background, a surgical intervention that produced calm, manageable behavior looked like progress. Moniz received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949. In the United States, the procedure was adopted and modified by a physician named Walter Freeman. Freeman was not a surgeon. He had no surgical training, but he developed what he called the transorbital lobotomy, in which a modified ice pick was inserted through the eye socket above the eyeball and used to sever the frontal lobe connections without drilling through the skull. This procedure could be performed in minutes. It required no operating room. Freeman performed it in his office with a local anesthetic. He performed it without anesthetic in some cases. He performed it on children. Between 1936 and 1967, approximately 40,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States. Freeman alone performed approximately 2,900. He traveled the country in a vehicle he called the lobotomobile, performing lobotomies at state institutions at a rate that occasionally reached 25 procedures in a single day. At one point in the late 1940s, he was the only non-surgeon in the United States performing a surgical procedure at this scale. He was not supervised. He was celebrated. Time magazine covered him. He appeared on radio programs. The procedure was described in mainstream publications as a genuine advance in the treatment of human suffering. The outcomes were documented, in aggregate, almost nowhere. The individual outcomes that are documented are varied in the worst possible way. Some patients became calm and functional enough to leave institutions. Many became permanently and severely cognitively impaired, unable to work, care for themselves, or form complex thoughts. Some were left in vegetative states. Some died during the procedure or shortly afterward. Freeman's mortality rate across his career was approximately 2%, meaning roughly 58 of the people he personally treated died from the procedure. He considered this acceptable. One of Freeman's patients was a 23-year-old woman named Rosemary Kennedy, younger sister of the future President of the United States. In 1941, Rosemary's father, Joseph Kennedy, authorized Freeman to perform the procedure without the knowledge of Rosemary's mother. She had been mildly intellectually disabled and prone to mood instability. After the lobotomy, she was unable to speak coherently, walk, or care for herself. She lived in a care institution for the remaining 63 years of her life. She died in 2005. The Kennedy family did not publicly disclose her existence until 1960. Freeman was stripped of his hospital privileges in 1967 after a patient died during what would have been her third lobotomy, the third time the same patient was subjected to the procedure. Freeman continued to follow up with former patients until shortly before his death in 1972. He appeared to genuinely believe he had helped them. Antipsychotic medication, chlorpromazine, became available in 1954. Within a decade, it had transformed the management of severe mental illness. It was not a cure, but it worked without destroying the frontal lobe. Lobotomy rates declined sharply after 1954 and had largely ceased by the mid-1960s in most Western countries. Moniz survived an assassination attempt in 1939. A former patient shot him in the spine and left him partially paralyzed. He continued his research from a wheelchair. He wrote about the lobotomy's success rate with the same clinical detachment he had applied to his original papers. He died in 1955, still believing he had been right. The Nobel Committee has never rescinded his prize. Several petitions have been submitted requesting that they do so. None have succeeded. The prize citation still describes the lobotomy as a contribution to psychiatry. 6 inventions. The first was meant to make mining safer. The second was meant to eradicate malaria. The third was framed as a shortcut to peace. The fourth insulated the industrial age from fire. The fifth made engines run without knocking. The sixth was meant to calm the most severe suffering in a system that had run out of other options. None of these were built from cruelty. Most of the men who built them believed, in the language and knowledge of their time, that they were solving real problems. Some of them were right. Nobel's dynamite did save construction workers. Müller's DDT did save children from malaria. Haber's nitrogen fixation does feed half the world today. The problem was never the first question. The problem was the second question, the one that doesn't get asked until after the bodies are counted. The pattern across all 6 is not malice. It is a particular kind of blindness, the blindness of the inventor to the environment outside the problem they set out to solve. Every one of these men solved the problem they were looking at. Every one of them failed to see the larger system they were operating in. Nobel saw the unstable explosive and not the political landscape that would weaponize its stable replacement. Müller saw the mosquito and not the food chain. Haber saw the trench and not the factory where his chemistry would arrive 50 years later. The asbestos industry saw the fibers and not the lungs. Midgley saw the engine and not the air. Freeman saw the agitated patient and not the person behind the agitation. The question this record raises is not whether these men were good or bad. Most of them were neither, in the way that most people are neither. The question is structural. At what point in the process of invention does someone bear responsibility for uses they did not intend and effects they did not foresee? Nobel had 8 years between his obituary and his death to think about this. He chose to create prizes. Müller had the Nobel ceremony on one side and the silent spring on the other, and the record does not show that he ever spoke publicly about what he thought. Haber lectured on the morality of chemical warfare and concluded that he had been right. Midgley demonstrated leaded gasoline on his own skin and called it safe. The Asbestos executives wrote memos about how to keep dying workers from filing lawsuits. Freeman drove his lobotomobile from one state institution to the next and reviewed his case files at the end of each day and found them satisfactory. The law, in most jurisdictions, has not answered the question of responsibility. Patents do not require safety assessments beyond the immediate application. Nobel's estate funds a peace prize. Müller's compound is still in use. Midgley's lead is still measurable in the bones of anyone born before 1985. Asbestos is still legal in roughly half the countries on Earth. The second question is still not mandatory. 6 inventions, 160 million dead. The patents are still valid. The next video is about a building. An architect designed it. It was celebrated at its opening, and within a year the architect was petitioning the city to tear it down. His petition was denied. The building stood for another 22 years before it was finally demolished, not because the architect had been right, but because it had become too expensive to maintain. His name is still attached to the architectural style he pioneered. He considers this his greatest embarrassment. That is the next video.